Thanks, Len. I really appreciate the kind words. And thank you all so much for having me here. It's really quite an honor. I have been in Baton Rouge a couple times. I was here the day after Katrina's landfall, and because I couldn't get into New Orleans, I ended up in Baton Rouge for a couple days before I got to New Orleans, and came back a year later when the Times actually opened a bureau. Chris, my old friend Chris Drew, I think was in that bureau for a while, where we sent a bunch of reporters, and we were in Louisiana for well over a year, I guess, covering the aftermaths of that terrible hurricane. It's really an honor to be here. Len has put my concerns at rest. I understand you still have a tiger, and that's really great. You know, I'm here. I was asked to come and talk a little bit about Anonymous. I'm gonna sort of leave a lot of that conversation to my talk with Len and to your questions, which I'll probably try to mostly evade. But I would like to talk a bit about the op-ed page, what it means to the New York Times, what it means in journalism today. And out of that, I hope maybe you'll get a better understanding of the significance of not just anonymous, but opinion journalism right now in this moment, this very sort of divisive moment in our nation's history. So let me start with a little bit of history, and I'm going to tell you about where this page came from. The New York Times is 170 years old. The op-ed page is only 48 years old, so it's kind of a young adult still. There was a great history of it written by a journalism professor named Michael Sokolow, as he pointed out, the New York Times didn't really invent the idea of a page opposite the editorial page that would have outside contributors. This idea had been kicking around at other newspapers. But the Times really revolutionized it and made it a thing that others copied. And this was all the brainchild of a New York Times editor named John Oakes. Oakes was an editorial writer and a member of the Times' ruling family, the Oakes family. He believed in the power of analytical journalism. He wanted to go beyond the straight reporting of news. And he also believed that it was very important for the Times to diversify the voices of opinion on its pages. And that's how he came to this idea, to allow outside writers to contribute to the page. His goal was to open a bastion of the Times to novelists, poets, academics, politicians, factory workers, prisoners, soldiers, ministers in pulpits, doctors in operating rooms, anyone with an interesting experience to describe, a compelling voice to opine with, and the ability to construct a good sentence and a strong argument. He believed that there was a universe of ideas floating around out there that the Times itself and its editorial board that wrote the paper's unsigned editorials were not able to always articulate. And that it was worth publishing these opinions right next to our editorials. His explanation for creating the page was just that, to diversify and even challenge the Times' own opinions. Sometimes people think the op-ed page, sometimes the goal of the op-ed page is to say the opposite of what our editorials are saying. But there was another explanation he gave that I think is more important and one that I hold on to dearly. It's one that Oakes had described years before in a speech at Columbia Journalism School back in 1954. And in that speech, he said that the responsibility of newspapers was the same as for colleges, and that is to make people think. He said this, quote, "The minute we begin to insist that everyone think the same way we think, our democratic way of life is in danger." To make people think, it sounds really simple, but sometimes it's not. For years, Oakes lobbied for this brainchild of his, and finally on September 21st, 1970, after years of study, which is a Times tradition, study things to death, it became reality. In its inaugural op-ed page, they had three outside contributors, a guy named W.W. Rostow, who was a foreign affairs advisor to President Johnson, an essay by the very famous Chinese writer Han Suyin, and a critique of Vice President Spiro Agnew's anti-liberal vocabulary by a journalist. An editor's note introduced the page this way, quote, "As the world has grown smaller, the nation more powerful, the problems besetting man infinitely more complex, the pressures more intense, the health of this democracy has increasingly depended on deeper public understanding of difficult issues. In the first year of its existence, the page published 2 future presidents, Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. It published the liberal theologian Reinhold Niebuhr and the conservative preacher Billy Graham. How did it go over? By one measure, imitation, really well. Other papers quickly adopted the innovation, but not everybody was impressed. This was a time, you'll have to remember, of extraordinary turmoil, of political divisiveness and social conflict. A time, some would say, not unlike our own today. Questions were growing about Richard Nixon's fitness to govern amid emerging evidence of abuses of power and even criminality. Yet a large percentage of voters continued to support him, doggedly, loyally. The civil rights movement was in full gear, and debates about race relations raged. The war in Vietnam was still underway, and the country was torn by protests. Abortion, drugs, sexual revolution, the country was reeling in debates that touched every facet of our lives. And so, there wasn't yet an internet, and the only social media were newspapers, televisions, radio, and telephone. But people did live in their own bubbles at that time. Maybe not as constrained as our bubbles today, but bubbles nevertheless. And so what some readers read on that op-ed page that they considered interesting, reasonable, even obvious opinions, many others thought were absurd distortions, falsehoods, or propaganda. Some early critics of the op-ed page complained that it reached for deliberate outrage, as they put it. We might call that trolling today. An internal review wondered whether the page was relying too heavily on extremists, while alternatively, some questioned whether it really offered a true diversity of opinions. Still another person asked if the section relied too heavily on name writers as opposed to just good writing. 48 years later, how familiar those complaints sound to me. Yet today, John Oakes' innovation is, it seems, a smashing success. Almost every newspaper and news website in the world publishes opinion essays by outside contributors. Op-eds are now done as short films, videos, podcasts, graphics, cartoons, and photo essays. A virtual op-ed industrial complex has emerged that channels essays from academics, writers, filmmakers, and celebrities to people like me. The form is so popular that even news pages have gotten into the business of running first-person narratives, once the province of the op-ed page. Our section has evolved as well. We produce satirical videos, short documentaries, op-eds built on charts instead of sentences. Last year, the Times won its first ever Pulitzer in editorial cartooning for a series in our Sunday Review chronicling the first months of 2 Syrian refugee families in the United States, titled Welcome to the New World. Since I joined the page in 2016, we've hired 2 right-of-center writers from the Wall Street Journal, Bret Stephens and Barry Weiss. But we've also hired 2 progressive columnists, Michelle Goldberg and Michelle Alexander. We continue to publish famous names. Last week alone, I edited pieces by George Shultz on nuclear weapons, Bernie Sanders on Yemen, and James Baker on Saudi Arabia. And in the early days of the Me Too movement, we published first-person essays about sexual harassment and assault by Selma Hayek, Uma Thurman, and Lupita Nyong'o. But I'm just as proud of the things we've published by unfamous names, the little-known, up-and-coming writers, the people who live in the shadows, the average Joes and Josephines. We've published pieces by dissidents from Syria, North Korea, and China, a political prisoner in Egypt, undocumented immigrants in the American West. One of our videos described the plight of teachers who make so little money that they have to live in their cars. A heartbreaking essay by the wife of a former NFL player chronicled his battle with severe brain injuries caused by the violence of football. Each of these pieces, in my view, has been in service to John Oakes' dictum: show people ideas, experiences, and opinions that make them think. And that brings me to the reason you all brought me here today, the anonymous op-ed. As Len has noted, September 5th. It's amazing he remembered that date. I can't tell you much of the backstory of the piece, although Len will try to get me to. but I can say this. The writer, he or she, is a real person, not a creation of our imaginations. And she or he is indeed in a position to know the things that she or he described in that piece. The response to the essay, which was titled, "I Am Part of the Resistance Inside the Trump Administration," was swift and furious. There was some applause for the writer, but as much and probably more was criticism. The president complained that the piece had compromised national security, though it's a little hard to quite see how that might be the case. Conservatives described the author as a coward and of being part of a quiet coup d'etat, as one put it. Liberals were no less scathing. Some questioned why the writer hadn't had the courage to stand up, be named, and quit the administration in protest. Former President Obama weighed in on social media, asserting that secretive resistance to the president's agenda was not the right way to protest it. Bob Woodward, known for his use of anonymous sources, complained that the piece lacked enough detail to be worth publishing. Masha Gessen in The New Yorker, an occasional opinion writer for The New York Times, or she used to be, said that the piece was quite, quote, a ploy by someone who wants to distance himself from what he, and it's her use of the male pronoun, not mine, perceives to be an imperiled administration, while capitalizing on whatever credibility and popularity the presidency still retains. The article added little to the public's understanding of the administration, an understanding that has already been shaped by seemingly endless leaks and rumors from within the White House, unquote. There have been a few voices in support. I'll just quote one. Michael Socolow, again, the guy who wrote the history of our page. He had this to say in Politico. The op-ed page, he said, quote, was designed specifically to give Times readers an opportunity to judge for themselves the value of unmediated communication that's unique in the newspaper. And because newspapers exist to print news, he noted, quote, had this senior official come forward and the Times rejected the publication of the essay without identification, it would have committed journalistic malpractice. He went on, quote, had the Times not published the anonymous op-ed, we never would have been able to have this debate. That in itself vindicated publication and redeems the vision of John B. Oakes, unquote. Not surprisingly, I think Michael Socolow gets it. But I have no problem with the criticism, and here's why. Just as Socolow points out, it showed that the piece had made people think. Consider the debate that blossomed, perhaps exploded is the right word, around the essay. Let's get away from speculation about whether the essay was intended to signal a coup or a collapse or an impending tide of resignations. At its core, the piece was about how one person, and perhaps others, were dealing with a president whose agenda they partly supported, but whose behavior they had come to find reckless, ill-informed, and amoral. The writer and the others that he or she was purporting to represent were wrestling with fundamental moral questions. Was the choice to stay in the administration the right one? Were they traitors? Were they heroes? Was the writer, as one of my editors put it, Seneca, trying to remain an ethical person while serving a corrupt emperor? Or was the writer and the others the writer talked about, as Masha Gessen writes, an active perpetrator in the degradation that they claimed to abhor? I have my own view on these things, but it's really not relevant. I think these are all questions worth debating, whether about this administration or any future administration. We on the op-ed page don't expect people to agree with all the pieces we publish. That would be a sign of op-ed malpractice. We are, as the media critic Jack Schaefer put it, not meant to be anyone's safe space. Indeed, as I sometimes tell our staff, it is our role to publish things that we sometimes are uncomfortable with ourselves. We strive to make our pieces as factual as possible, as clearly written as possible, and to have as good a faith and argument as possible. But we cannot, in this time of political division and growing intellectual intolerance, when people only want to listen to views they already agree with, publish only the things that fit our personal views of the world. We don't have all the answers, and neither does any single reader or writer. It is only in our national conversation, in the battle of our collective ideas, in the roiling arena of our civic life, that the truth can emerge. So I'll leave you with a quote from one of our columnists, David Leonhardt, on why opinion journalism matters, particularly now. Quote, "These days," he wrote, "it's more important than ever to listen to people who disagree with you. Maybe they'll teach you something new, or maybe they'll just teach you how to beat them." Thanks for having me.